Hey guys, Sebastian from Madrigal here. This is the level editor for Traction Point. It's a game I'm developing using my own game engine and tools. Now, quite often working with my own tools means working with janky tools, perhaps even subpar tools. But every now and then I make something that turns out really well. There are some features that I've developed over the years that I wouldn't necessarily want to live without, even if I were to switch to another game engine. And today we're going to highlight one of those, namely the BlenderSync system, which allows my level editor to talk to Blender and send data back and forth seamlessly. I want to cover BlenderSync because I think it is perhaps the coolest thing to come out of the entire Basis game engine development. I've actually made a video about BlenderSync some years ago, but it is a little bit painful to watch these days, and I think it is way overdue for a refresh. So let's cover that. I will link the original video in the description below though, if you want to take a look. Alright, so what are we talking about here? Well, first of all, we have the level. You can see that this level is in the white box stage, so it's not fully decorated yet. In the white box stage, we typically figure out things like how big is the level going to be? What shape are things going to be? Where will you be able to play in the level? That sort of stuff. And we do have a few decorative objects here, like these trees, and there's another one over here. But these are only really here to sort of help me establish the scale of things, because without any familiar visual objects or cues, it's kind of difficult to say how large something's going to be. Same thing with these mannequins here. They're really only here for the scale. And of course, we can create more of these kinds of things. We can create more rocks here. We can put in trees, instantiate them several times, and all of that. But this is pretty limited, of course, because you can only really add things that you have prepared beforehand. Because, of course, these things need to be modeled somewhere, and they need to be put into a form where you can place them in the level. But what if you wanted to model something that fits specifically within this level? It might be a completely unique mesh, or it might be a mesh that you can use a few times, but still something that you want to model almost as if you were modeling in the level. Let's take a look at this piece of cliff here. If we move it around a little bit, you can see, okay, that is the mesh that makes up this piece of cliff. A few things. First, it kind of fits onto this next cliff in a very exact way. And it also kind of follows the shape of the terrain here. So it's very clearly sort of modeled for this particular place in the level. How would you go about modeling something like this? It's not super easy to do that. You would really need something like Unity's Pro Builder, where you can actually model in the level editor itself, or you would somehow need to be able to jump back and forth between Blender and the level editor to make sure that it fits nicely. And my solution to this is called BlenderSync, and it's a little bit like the latter, but it's much more easy to use and quick and snappy than you might imagine. Alright, so let's model something that actually benefits from this system. We can do that by adding a quick mesh into the level. The quick mesh is sort of like the entry point into the BlenderSync system. And you can see that by default it is represented by cube until you actually start to modify it. And it has a button called Edit in Blender. But before we click that, let's move that to the side. And we can see here that we have Blender actually running in the background. This is not how I would normally work. I would put these on different monitors. This is just to show you guys both of these things at the same time. So in Blender we don't have anything, we have an empty scene collection, but we do have something called the Basis BlenderSync server running here. I'll get back to what that means in a little bit. So now if we click Edit in Blender, we can see, oh, the object jumps over to this side. Let's turn on random colors and set vertex snapping on. So this thing is called BlenderSync target. That's an important name. It's the name that the system uses to identify the object that we are currently editing. Other than that, this is a completely normal Blender object, so we can just make it into a house, for example, do a smart UV project, And if we are happy with our edit, we can do finish editing, we can update and keep editing, or we can cancel the edit. So let's do finish editing, and that basically sends the data back to the game engine. Now we have our house here. Pretty cool. We can still move it around. Move it somewhere there, for example. We can rotate it. We simply got the mesh data back. And you can see that there was no messing around with files, no explicit export steps, anything like that. It's all handled for you by the system. So that was pretty cool, but that was hardly anything that I couldn't have done just the traditional way. The magic starts to happen when you actually include a little bit of the surroundings. So here we have a white sphere showing you how much of the surroundings to include. Let's make that like 50. And basically that tells us how much of the level do you want to actually bring into Blender as a guide, as a visual cue when you are modeling this object. We're still only editing this one object here, but we can bring in a little bit of surrounding geometry to help you with that. Let's click Edit in Blender, and now we can see that, oh, now we have a lot more. Well, first of all, the object moved. I rotated and moved it here in the scene. It did the same here. So now we're actually rotating the object, not just the geometry. Other than that, we have this other object called the BlenderSync surroundings object. And since we have random colors on, Blender helpfully renders them in distinct colors. And now we can start to actually snap these guys to the points in the surroundings. And I'm sure you can start to see how this can be super handy when modeling something that needs to, match the surroundings exactly. So now if we do a Smart UV project, and we can click Update and Keep Editing, for example. That means that the stuff will get sent back to the level editor, or we can still keep working on it here in this, if you just want to see what it looks like. Here we can see that, okay, we have a little bit of wonkiness going on with this face here. It's clearly not planar. Maybe we should make it planar, like that, and then finish editing, and now it's fixed. So pretty cool. What if we now were to dig a hole in the ground? Like this, and maybe add, let's do a scout vehicle. For some reason it's important to the size of this thing that we have a scout vehicle. If we now click Edit in Blender again, we have both the hole there. Admittedly, it's not exactly the same as this because they get tessellated differently. But it's there, and we have the scout vehicle, actually fully detailed. But you can see that this thing is actually triangulated because this thing comes essentially from the graphics engine. And yes, my cars don't have wheels in the editor, which makes it look a little strange. But regardless, this editable geometry here, or the geometry that we're supposed to be editing, is still made out of quads. We can add subdivision surface modifiers to this thing, and they work. If we move this back to the level editor, we can see that the modifier is here. And if we edit in Blender again, we can see that the modifier is still here, and we can remove it if we want to. But you really shouldn't go and do a whole lot of editing of this other stuff, because this is essentially throwaway data. It gets generated every time you edit the mesh, just to make sure that you get the most up-to-date version of the geometry sent over to Blender. That's kind of like the idea. If we don't want to actually make any changes, we can click Cancel Edit, and it asks you, are you sure you want to do that? So that's pretty cool. One of the most useful things with this, though, is the fact that this is essentially, under the hood, this is a normal Blender file. And that means that if you want to, let's take that away. If you want to later on turn this piece of geometry into just a normal Blender file that you manage along with all of your other normal Blender files. There's nothing preventing you from quite simply doing file and save copy and then saving this file out somewhere. At that point, it is beyond the reach of the BlenderSync system and it can't modify that file anymore. And that's really handy when you have something like this piece of cliff here. You are modifying this and making sure it looks nice in the white box level. And then at some point you want to decorate it, you want to texture it, you want to tweak it. You can quite simply do an edit in Blender. Oh, I have face orientation on here. And do a save copy. And at that point, you then have a completely normal Blender file that you can use as a sort of starting point for your fully decorated version of this guy. When that guy is done, you simply replace this quick mesh with the final fully decorated one, if you want to. You can see here that when we actually switch to this piece, now our weird funky looking subdivision surface modified piece of geometry here is now actually part of the surroundings object. So how does the system work on a technical level? Well, we have essentially two sides. We have a little bit of stuff here in the level editor. We have a little bit of stuff here in Blender. When we select one of these quick meshes and we click Edit in Blender, what we're actually doing is we're pulling out an internally stored blend file out of the level data, containing the data for just this editable piece here. Not the surroundings, just the editable piece itself. And that is why, when we click Edit in Blender and we go have a look at this topography here, we can see the same nice, mostly quad-based topography that we saw in Blender last time around. We can also see the same modifier stack, and if we have any geometry nodes, or things like that, they're also present. But the same is not true for the surroundings. So if we have surroundings data, and we edit a quick mesh, the graphics engine actually exports this part of the level as an OBJ file. And then it sends that OBJ data along with the blend data to Blender. And it does that every time you modify a quick mesh, just to make sure that we have the most up-to-date data. That is also why, if you take a look at the topography here for the surroundings object, it's actually all triangulated data, because this thing has run through the graphics engine. Then when we go the other way around, and we click Finish Editing here, we actually do two things. First of all, we store the data, the up-to-date data for this object in the blend file, which we send back to the level editor so that it can store it internally in the level data for later possible editing. But we also need to export this mesh into a format that the game engine can read, because the game engine can't read blend files, it can only store them. So to be able to actually see this mesh here in the level, we need to export it into a format that the engine understands. And that is why, if we look at the Blender preferences here, in Basis BlenderSync, we actually have a mesh converter exe path. So whenever we click Finish or Update and Continue, we convert the mesh into a format that the game engine can then read. And we send both that and the blend file back. We also have a port number, 1950 currently. That has to do with this server here. So if we cancel this edit, and then we stop the server. Now this is just a normal Blender instance, has nothing to do with BlenderSync. And if we try to edit this in Blender now, we should momentarily get an error. Is the BlenderSync server running in Blender? Indeed it is not. So the idea here is that you can have multiple instances of Blender running, but you should only ever have one where the server is running. And that instance shouldn't be used to open files normally, because then if you click Edit in Blender, then your data might get overwritten. Now the server is implemented as an add-on here in Blender, which contains this handy little menu here. As we already discussed, the server uses these names to identify the objects in the scene. So the editable object should always be called BlenderSync target. The surroundings is BlenderSync surroundings object. We also have a BlenderSync helpers, which we can create here from this button if we don't have it. The BlenderSync helpers object is a handy little thing which we can sometimes use if we have additional objects in the scene that we want to use for something. Let's say we want to cut a hole here into this rock, and we need this kind of object so that we can add a Boolean operator, and we can use that object as the cutter essentially. We might not want to lose this object, and that is why the BlenderSync helpers collection is there. Anything that is put into that is brought over in between edits. All of the other stuff is deleted, so that we only have the BlenderSync target and the surroundings object at the root level. And that is essentially everything that the BlenderSync system will ever want to have on the root level. Everything that is in the BlenderSync helpers collection is considered something that the system doesn't know about what the user wants to have. So it can be a pretty handy thing to have. And of course, now if we finish editing, we get our nice little hole there. And if we edit it in Blender, we have the object still present. So in a nutshell, if you wanted to implement something like this into your own tech stack, it shouldn't be that much of a hassle. There's only a few things that you need to be able to support something like this. First of all, you need to be able to export a piece of your level data into some common format. I use OBJ just because that is easy to generate. It's text-based after all. But any of the Blender supported formats should be just fine. Second of all, you need to be able to essentially hot update your mesh data as it comes in from Blender so that you can see the changes in your level editor. And third, you need some way to communicate with Blender. I recommend using a network connection, but any IPC strategy should work just fine. And that is perhaps my favorite thing about this whole system, just the simplicity of it all. I think I implemented the initial version in a couple of weeks, and if we add all the bug fixes I've done to it over the years, I think we can add maybe one more week to that. And this thing has just absolutely transformed the way I do level design. You know, if you take a look here at some of this stuff, all of this is BlenderSync Quick Mesh geometry. So here, for example, we have this piece of rock here. Maybe someone would go like, oh, okay, that's a bit close to the road there. Maybe the player would actually get caught on that. And you just open it in Blender, and even though it's a pretty large object, it doesn't take very long for it to export the surroundings and all of that. And then you find that object and you move it a little to the side, and Bob's your uncle. And then you can go on to the next place. It's just so absolutely easy and immediate, and you have the whole context. It's wonderful. And of course, at some point you will probably take this whole thing, you will edit it in Blender one last time, and then you will save it as a copy. And doing that, you will produce a classical, normal Blender file where you can then do your texturing and stuff like that. You can, of course, do texturing when it is a part of the BlenderSync system, but at that point I would probably recommend that you just yoink it out of the system and manage the file yourselves. But you can keep doing BlenderSync stuff for a remarkably long time before you actually have to do anything else. And some of these things you can just keep as BlenderSync equivalents all throughout. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you found this interesting. If you have any questions regarding this or anything else, I'll be happy to answer them in the comments below. And if you'd like to follow the development of Traction Point a little bit closer, then I invite you to join the Discord, where you can stay truly up to date with what is going on. And with that, I thank you for your time. I remind you to subscribe, press the like button, and have a great day.